All right, we should be quote unquote live now. So I'm here with, is it Kevin Bird?
Yep, that's correct.
Kevin Bird. Okay, it sounds like a Pixar character, and we're here to discuss. Well, originally I was here to discuss issues of heritability and racial traits, but upon examination of previous discussions you've had with JF, what I was hoping to do, perhaps, and I think we have about 1 or 2 hours, perhaps, to have this conversation. I'm hoping. I was hoping to kind of go over values and explain maybe the reasons why people care about this. Now, I'm going to give you a chance to introduce yourself. You are a critic of the alt-right and a person that broadly affiliates themselves with the left?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so can you, this has nothing to do with this conversation, but perhaps for the audience, maybe you could give a little bit about yourself in terms of your research interests and your ideological persuasion, just so people get sort of an idea of where you're coming from.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a PhD student in evolutionary biology, focusing on genome duplications and gene duplications. So what happens when large-scale structural differences take place in genomes, mostly in plants, and looking at short-term evolutionary implications, long-term evolutionary impacts for novel traits and kind of huge evolutionary leaps. In my bachelor's work, I did a few published works on convergent evolution, population genetics, and phylogenetics of a crop species. I've done a little bit of quantitative genetics of biochemistry of plants. So dabbled here and there across plant genetics and genomics.
All right, but in your ideological persuasion is left.
So yeah, so it's broadly left. I can't say that I've read, the canon of leftist literature. I sort of conservatively called myself anti-capitalist because there's a broad approach from social democracy.
I'm not so sure what anti-capitalist means.
It basically means that I think that the current system has some severe issues, and I think it's a fundamental issue with capitalism and like the market, the ownership of different aspects of the economy, whether it's public or private. And I'm sort of agnostic over whether the answer is more like left libertarianism, democratic socialism, social democracy. I'm still personally feeling that out, and before I kind of have a strong stance, I won't really jump into one side too much.
Okay, well, just so we're symmetrical here, I am a PhD student who's finishing their degree soon, hopefully. I come from a quantitative background, but that's pretty irrelevant because here on YouTube, I run a YouTube channel. And I would say that I don't like describing myself politically if I can help it. But quite frankly, I'm a radical person on the right. I consider my ideology pretty distinct from the alt-right, but I think there probably are certain overlapping qualities we have, especially when it comes to skepticism about how modern people have been approaching human organization for the last 300 years, and especially about how modern mechanistic society works. Now, maybe that makes me anti-capitalist. I couldn't tell you because I have no fucking, I'm sorry, I have no idea what capitalism means. It's about to drop the F-bomb there. But, the vague terminology kind of irritates me. Maybe I could, start this way. So I'm a person who's been a big critic of the alt-right. So far, things like essentially trying to organize society along the lines of race. Don't care about race. Don't care about genetics. I don't care about purity or some kind of genetic lineage that exists in a particular category. But I do care very deeply about something called posterity. And posterity is a broader term, something that everyone would have known about 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and that most people care deeply about anywhere outside of the first world, and even in the first world, anywhere outside of a few elite cities. And posterity is simply the descendants that I hand down things to, either genetically or culturally. The people who carry on my society, the people who carry on my traditions, the people who carry on my faith, and the people who also carry on my genes. It's basically the union of all of those groups. And that's something that I care deeply about. Now, I think this is the thing. There is a reason why the critiques that the alt-right brings are deeply concerning to people who even don't care about race. And I think that I'm going to start there is what do you make of the critique ideologically that the alt-right makes about society and the functioning of multiracial societies before we get into the science?
So a lot of the issues that I have with sort of the alt-right critique is that I feel like a lot of it is steeped in an ahistorical picture of what the past was as something to move forward to, but in a way back to, something to reclaim, and also an ad hoc justification of current socio-political factors. A lot of it feels to me to be begging the question isn't quite right, but when your answer to why are certain ethnic or minority groups not achieving as well, and the answer is their inherent inferiority or some sort of like fundamental disjoint between these two groups, I have a hard time believing that given a lot of the history and the development of those interactions through time. And so that's where I
But
think the
is
alt-right
their
has a
contention factual or value based? Like, say, for instance, I was to prove to you, even though I'm not an expert, because, well, I mean, maybe you can explain why the people on the alt right aren't here. But if someone were to prove to you the contentions that they made genetically were true, would your ideology shift at all?
No, it wouldn't.
It wouldn't.
So
Well, why
yes,
not?
so I think there's a value, um, just an inherent value that should be respected. I don't think that one, a meritocracy is even kind of real or possible.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm against meritocracy too, by that matter.
yeah, and so I don't think that the allotment of resources, especially when practically resources are very very immense, there's no reason why those can't be distributed in a way so that everybody can um, reach some sort of level of well-being throughout their life for for them and theirs.
Pardon me, I had to type something. Well, that's kind of odd, don't you think? I mean, you're arguing over a factual consideration that you know manifestly does not have bearing on the political issues at hand.
Yeah, so the way I think about it, there's different components to moral arguments and value claims. You have the descriptive statements that serve the foundation. You have your normative argument that sort of moves from the is to the ought.
So, no,
Um,
I understand the is-ought distinction. I think most people who watch my channel do, so we don't need to rehash that. But what I would say is interesting is I talk to a lot of very thoughtful writers, and they, like myself, wouldn't change any of their positions when I've asked them this. They wouldn't change any of their positions even if you could prove uniform distribution of traits on racial groups.
Sure. So,
Does
in
that
my
surprise you?
no, it doesn't. My
Why
goal
do
in
you
this
think it is?
has never been to convince um, staunch and vocal supporters of the alt
No,
right.
I'm asking you to try to understand them. I'm
Oh,
not asking you to
oh
convince them.
yeah,
I'm not an alt-right person.
yeah. No, I mean, I can understand that there's a an intrinsic value that they hold that forms the core of the belief, with or without the empirical facts. It explains why the empirical facts have changed through time, and kind of shape differently depending on how people respond to it. So,
It just seems strange. And I'll give you, here's the thing, though. I mean, the contention that I'm concerned about.
mhm.
This is sort of where my concern enters in. So we've noticed now that really our ideological presuppositions don't have anything to do with this. I mean, do you care about posterity in the way that I described it? Do you care about the group of individuals that descends from both your genes and culture in the future?
Not
In that
entirely.
gen, you
And
don't.
I think I also just have a general broader sense of what my posterity would be. Um, I also
Well,
typically
okay, but that's. I mean, you're going to have to clarify because those are two different positions. One is you don't care about your posterity. The other one is I just have a more general view of my
yeah,
posterity.
So I'll say
So
that
do
the magnitude with which I care about my posterity is not very large. And the way I conceptualize posterity is less of direct relatives or line of dissension, and more broader social,
no,
national.
I consider posterity cultural too.
Okay.
I'm saying both my genetic lineage and the lineage of my culture and religion.
Mhm.
So under that
Yeah.
conception,
Um, no, not exactly. It's not my top priority. It's not. It
this is
doesn't form a core part of my value.
I know this is not right really why we're here talking. But this is I maintain this, and I maintain this
Mhm.
throughout both my conversations with the alt right and the left. The difference in ideology, as we demonstrated right here, is not a difference of fact; it's a difference of value,
Mhm.
right? And I think that's quite clear here, and it's quite clear from both your admission that the determinants of the factual matter does not actually detract from your ideological commitments. And similarly, that's not true for the alt right either. I would ask some. I haven't asked this to millennial woes, but
Mhm.
I've asked this to people like millennial woes, and I imagine I get the same response if I did ask it to millennial woes, and that is if I asked him if it was shown that, like I said, uniform distribution of all traits throughout all human populations that we can identify. Would that change your opinion? He'd probably say no. So, but Sargon thinks that this is a claim about fact when it's not. This is about values, and it's about people who value their posterity and people who don't care about posterity.
Mhm.
And I think that's the main reason why we have this divide.
Absolutely. I think similar sort of value divides that have a sort of factual proxy pop up in a lot of different scientific issues. Genetically modified organisms, climate change, all have a similar. Um,
Well, I mean, that's another thing too. Like, if you don't care about posterity, why care about climate change? But that's
mhm.
neither here nor there.
Yeah.
I mean, the left has been selling concern for climate change as a concern for posterity for 20 years now. But again, neither here nor there. But let me put it this way. I mean, you're not going to convince me that posterity is worthless or shouldn't be sacrificed for. And I'm probably not
Mhm.
going to convince you that a person is more than just their individual self and their lifetime. But I need to ask you this question. I mean, most of the world has my point of view, and most of this country
Mhm.
has my point of view. So, do you acknowledge that?
Yeah, I think I'm no stranger to extremely right wing or conservative type
No, no,
views.
no,
I
no.
know these aren't exactly the
Valuing
same.
posterity does not make me an extreme right winger. It
No.
makes me an average person in any society at any point in time before right now. I'm not trying to be pejorative, but people with your views are a very, very new phenomenon on this planet. And it's certainly a very new phenomenon among any kind of ruling class.
Interesting.
I'm dead serious about that too.
Mhm.
You'll have a hard time finding a time in society in the past or even in the present outside of, like I said, a few cities in the West or cities generally in the West. And I include East Lansing in that, right?
Mhm.
The you'll find a very hard time finding people, who don't value posterity. So I guess now I'm going to kind of recontextualize the argument. We're getting to the science, don't worry. Um, okay. But I think it's important that we establish this so we don't end up in word games. And you can't see why someone like me would care about this, given that I don't really care about race and genetic
Yeah.
purity all that much. Okay, but let's get to some questions. So for people who do care about posterity, right?
Mhm.
Um, do you understand why they would care about heritability of groups, especially under the regime of mass immigration?
Yeah, I think the reasoning behind
So
it
you do
makes
you see.
sense.
So they're right to care about the heritability of traits if they care about posterity.
On a factual level, no, because
This
I
is no,
think that
okay.
I think
No,
there.
no, 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 okay. Uh, okay. Well, maybe I'm sorry. I don't. I think you didn't state the question. This is a question about, will this disrupt their values, given that you're acknowledging their values?
I think that there can be a recontextualizing of what these data show that can
You're not
be
answering my
compatible with
question.
their
I'm not answering
values.
anything about fact. I said, if the fact is true and they hold those values, will this just hurt what they value? Posterity.
Hmm.
Because I think the answer is quite obviously yes.
You think
I
so?
think it's transparently so. Yeah, I think that's, if you're wondering why this is happening right now, uh, this is ground zero.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're saying, and it's not even, we could take radical examples, right? I mean, there's the example that if you have a certain space for your culture, and then a bunch of cultures that are potentially hostile to it come in, even if they're kept in check by an overarching political order, there's going to be less space for you to expand and practice your own culture. We've seen this historically very, very clearly. And the idea that you can hold back animus between these groups is uh, quite questionable. I would say. I think that's almost impossible at this stage, especially if the strong claims or even the light claims of the alt right factually are true.
I guess I can see that, but I feel like there's been a lot of historical immigration where animosity was sort of at the starting point, and then that's eventually ameliorated, and there's been room
But
to breathe for a lot of
if you
cultures.
look at what I mean, like let's go through your examples and I'll explain why there are concerns persisting with this current wave. I mean, what are your examples of the good immigration?
So I would think, around the, um, 19th century Italian, Polish,
Yeah,
Jewish
okay.
immigration.
Yeah, sure. So that is a good example. I mean, here is the problem. The problem is that America at that time had way more empty space. It was pushing people further to the west, so there was more space to expand. Second of all, right now, as a proportion, as sort of, I mean, in absolute terms, our immigration rate's much higher. As a proportion, we're roughly similar. But again, the country isn't empty. But the third one and the most important one, there's actually two more points. Thirdly, the difference between a pole, like cultures don't like, regardless of what you say about genetics, cultures have certain relationships, right? And if you take a culture, a Korean and a Chinese person might historically hate each other, but their culture is more similar than a Korean and an Australian Aborigine. And so there's a certain cultural proximity. In the case of Southern Europeans and Northern Europeans, there's a much closer proximity than Europeans and some entirely non-European group. And fourth, and most important one, is that we're just plainly not assimilating them. And I'm saying, and I'm explicitly here, is that the entire system of the U.S. was set up to explicitly and forcibly assimilate these groups into a broader American culture. And this was seen throughout all levels of the American educational system and also the American media messages. They all were pro patriotism. They all were e pluribus unum. They all were, we're going to forge one single unified American identity, and that identity is defined by the original Northern European concept of America. Right now, we do not have that ideologically ruling in any part of American society that's really controlling the narrative and the message of education or of media. Do you agree that those are caveats?
Um, Tracing back through as much as my working memory has stored so far, I think one thing that I would disagree with is the this idea that there's a relation between maybe the implication was there's a relation between geographic distance of cultures and their compatibility. Um, I
No,
don't.
no, no, no. I said I didn't propose a strong relationship. I said that there are relationships between different cultures have different compatibilities.
Well, so the reason I think that deserves a little bit more questioning is there is high amounts of animosity between Western and Eastern Europe, to the point that I don't think I would say that the cultures
Yeah.
have compatibility.
I
There's a lot of tension
didn't. No,
historically.
I'm sorry, but I explicitly confronted this with the Korea example.
Mhm.
Animosity, compatibility, and similarity are different things. People who are close to each other tend to have more animosity, but they also tend to have more similarity and compatibility if the political animosity is removed. So, for instance, like I said, a Chinese and a Korean, while they're at each other's throats historically all the time, their cultures kind of revolve around very similar principles, and even their religions are very similar. So, once you remove the political impetus, the conflict between the Korean king and, or was it a king and the Chinese empire, once you remove that, there was actually not so much that might keep those cultures from communicating in a common way. But the same thing really isn't as true for other peoples that might be more disparate in origin.
I feel like that's really tough to explore, and also it's a pretty heavy hypothetical to erase a majority of the history of the two cultures. I understand what you're trying to do with it, but I wonder how warranted that sort of hypothetical thinking is in the grand scheme of things when we're trying to understand the world here and now and how groups interact.
Well, I mean, the you have historical examples up the yin yang. I mean, if you want to disqualify the negative historical examples of conflicts among disparate peoples coming into the same area, we can. But that's a huge part of history there.
Mm.
Do I get to use that as evidence?
I'm sure.
Well, if I do, then I think my position is pretty much unassailable because most massive migrations have been followed by conflict. I mean, really, the American experiment in the 19th century is almost historically unique. No society has ever had that much immigration come into an area and not had wars break out because of it. I'm 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 waiting for another example, I guess, but to my knowledge, it's pretty unique. Okay, well, I mean,
Yeah.
so can you understand the I mean how red lights are kind of flashing here?
Yeah.
Value posterity. I mean, not to mention that, like I said, like let's take bad examples, like the fall of the Roman Empire began with a series of migrations of people who weren't really looking for a fight into Rome, into Roman territory, right? They were looking to essentially escape conflicts that were getting kicked up by another invasion by the Huns, which were people that came from essentially central Russia, right?
Mhm.
And they moved into Western Europe initially looking to settle down. But then they just decided that, okay, well, we'll just kill the people here and take their land, right? And this essentially resulted in about 200 or 300 years of a process where about a third of the people in Europe who are now were essentially killed and destroyed. Hello.
Yeah. No, I'm still here. I'm just processing. Sorry.
Hmm.
Um, so it what relation do you think that this sort of um, interaction between groups has in the modern world? I don't think we see. I think there's historically contingent ways that people interact when they meet, um, and at least the extent of these conflicts that you talk about historically, we haven't seen anything parallel, even with some fairly hefty immigration in the modern world.
Well, we have seen social order breakdown due to diversity increases. This has been well documented. It was originally well documented by Professor Robert Putnam, and that's studied and replicated. We see, well, I mean, Putnam was a lighter example. We see that in diverse societies, regardless of the income level, if the society is more diverse, people tend to participate in charities and in other social capital institutions much less.
But if you go back through the Putnam research, though, like one, that's the short term impact. In the long term, he can list a whole bunch of positive impacts of the meshing of cultures. But all
The positive impacts were mainly economical due to economies of scale.
well, okay. So the further point I was going to make was that further investigations into the results that Putnam saw really tied more into the prejudice of people who were experiencing a population.
That doesn't matter. Everyone does this though. Like
I don't.
everyone has in-group out-group preference. This is the reality of society, right?
That's very modifiable though. So
Is it
even
though?
the infant levels of response to a different face, a face of a different race, are based on
They're based on
exposure during
exposure. Yeah,
formation.
I mean that. I mean this is. I mean, frankly, that causes a lot of problem for the left generally because they've been trying to use reaction studies to justify endemic racism when it really all it measures is exposure, not racist attitudes.
Yeah.
Which is insane. But I mean, there goes half the left's justification for implicit bias being evidence of racism. But that's neither here nor there. The thing is that this is the thing. I don't care about race, but race kind of cares about me. You know, and this is the problem. I mean, let's take South Africa, right? I mean, would you want to be a white living in South Africa right now? I mean, what is your fate living in South Africa going forward? What is your children's fate if you just had a baby in South Africa as a white person?
I'm sure it'd still be fine. There's still quite a bit
Fine? Are you
of
kidding me?
political social capital, and
I mean, you must be kidding me, right? The presidents are singing songs about killing white people.
I mean, I would
mean,
have
okay,
absolutely no problem going to South Africa right now.
going to South Africa or raising a family there at like a lower middle class income. I'm not saying like you get to stay in the South African Hilton, tour around all of the areas, and then come back and get on a jet plane and going back. I'm talking about raising a family there long term.
Yeah, I don't think that's really
You're kidding
a
me.
major concern.
Would you? I mean, would you feel the same way in Zimbabwe in 1999? Hello?
Yeah, no, I'm
Would you
thinking.
feel the
Sorry,
same way
I
about
should.
Zimbabwe in 1999?
Zimbabwe would probably be different for a
Why?
cavalcade of reasons. One of them is
This
just
is the same society offset.
I mean, the general development of Zimbabwe and South Africa are different. I think the the history, the exact carrying out of these policies, comparing Mugabe to South Africa right now, is different.
How?
I mean, if you're asking if I was a white farmer in South Africa, even though a lot of the statistics and the disproportionate murders and killings are very overblown and based off of a questionable reading of the data, like
I'm sorry. I'm getting a little skeptical here. I mean, this is you seem to be trying to justify. I don't believe for a second like white progressives aren't moving to South Africa.
well, no, but I'm not moving to several other countries that would have a better outcome for me.
White progressives are moving to places, communities that are very, very white. That actually is a joke among conservatives that white progressives sequester themselves into racially homogenous communities.
I mean, if the idea is for me to defend a very broad umbrella of leftists or left/liberals, because I think there's an important distinction,
Well,
and
we'll
the
talk about
ways,
this later, but
yeah,
I'm sorry, but the thing is that uh, if I were a South African white, and like not like independently wealthy, right? Not like I can hire my own security team. Like I'd be terrified. And you'd be justified doing that. I mean, like the expulsions of minority populations from Africa has been de rigueur at this point. It's happened many times. It happened to Uganda, to the Asian populations there.
hmm
I get the sense that you understand that this is going on. You just don't want to admit that could be a danger or something that people are worried about.
I mean, I still am generally more skeptical of the scale and the impact of what's going on, whether or
What do
not
you mean the
it's.
scale or the impact? I mean, if you're an individual there, right? Like, I mean, whites are what, 10% of the population at this stage? Probably less at this stage.
I mean, I still like South Africa as an example. I don't think is a good one because there's still a lot of social and political capital that exists in white
What
South
do you even
Africans.
mean social and political capital?
Um, General prestige, political power, economic power, I think
How do
is
you measure
still.
prestige? I mean, you mean GDP.
I mean, there's a sociological component to um, respect you get from a community based off of your standing.
Well, no, I know what prestige is, but I'm just saying it's not measurable. Endeavor asks, why does every house in South Africa need a wall around it? Apparently, he's been to South Africa, and every South African house has an incredible security system.
Well, yeah, that happens in like white suburban populations.
Not in homogenous ones, in my experience.
I've I,
It happens in high crime areas.
personally, I've seen a lot of gated white communities without much of an actual threat.
Okay.
How
I
much
mean, I
how
know.
much of this is
I think we're just ignoring the reality of these things.
So how much of this effect do you think is just general developmental stages and instability of certain geopolitical regions, and how much do you think is actually a culture clash? Because I tend
I
to
think
think
this
that
is
the
a culture
extent to
class. I
which
think
it
this always
exists.
happens. I mean, like for instance, if you were Jewish in Russia, right? Like, wouldn't that be terrible to like? I mean, I'm sure like, oh, did Jews actually have like when you looked at the raw statistics, if you were a Jewish peasant, were you more likely to get murdered than a Russian peasant? Well, maybe not actually, right? Because Jewish peasants were a little bit richer, so they probably had less like random crime. But every several years there'd be like a pogrom, and they'd like move in and like kill your son and rape your daughter. Not so dissimilar from farm murders in South Africa. I mean, you know, given that crime is so high there, it's hard to say whether it rises above the noise of it being just generally an insanely violent place. But getting tortured to death, you know, as an explicit racial act of vengeance is a little bit more well, it kind of has a certain ring to it that's a little bit terrifying.
I, I generally question how comparable those two scenarios are because I think
Well, what's the
Russian
difference?
Russian Jews have a little bit more historical evidence to it. I
Really? I mean, I don't know. I mean, you're scoffing at evidence that neither of us have in front of us. And this is it's not like the problem is also, Kevin. We just see the same process occurring again and again and again, right? Like it's not like South Africa is it's not like South Africa, like it's not like, oh wow, a rich minority is getting vengeance killings against them by a larger population that doesn't make as much money on them. How could that possibly happen? This never happens in human societies. No, actually, it almost always happens in human societies. This is just what human societies do. Poor populations that see people who are racially different from them tend to actually be incredibly vindictive. Do we agree on that?
I would attribute different causation, especially South Africa with the history of apartheid. I think, you could paint the same sort of picture you're trying to paint with the Haitian Revolution.
But
Um,
we see that conflict doesn't need to have a specific policy behind it. I mean, there's like I said, there are conflicts between numerous groups. I mean, Thomas Sowell documents extensive number of what he calls, I forget, middlemen minorities, minorities that essentially are richer than the general population, whether they're Chinese in Malaysia or Jews in Russia or whites in Africa. And what's so funny about this, right, is the biggest example of this victimization that occurred in Africa is actually a victimization that happened between the Ugandan government and Asians in like the 80s.
so how do
And
you
apartheid didn't happen in any of those societies. So we can't just go like, oh, it's a one-time thing, apartheid.
how do you interpret these historical facts as a comment on perhaps an immutable aspect of human nature? Because
If I see
the jump
something
between the
recur
two is
again,
where I'm lost.
if I see something recur again and again and again, then I think that there's probably I think in probabilities because I'm a person who looks at stats. So I go, okay, there's a non-0%. I mean, if it happens again and again, obviously there's a non-0% chance of it happening a third time or a fourth time or a fifth time. If we've seen this 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, there's a non-zero of percent chance of it happening a 10th time. As a matter of fact, you would need a lot of evidence to convince me that it wouldn't happen the 10th time under a similar circumstance.
But that
This is sort
largely
of a
depends.
Bayesian way of looking at the universe. I assume how the universe operates in the past is going to be how it operates in the future, unless you have some very good evidence to show me to the contrary that can actually rule this out.
But that largely depends on the starting position. So if there was a society that allowed
Well, of course it
explosion
does.
to occur initially, or if there was a society that ameliorated inequality between different minority groups.
Okay, but I mean, so you're saying that if we can't ameliorate, so you're saying like, but that's a big thing because we historically minority groups have never had equality ameliorated, so we don't really have a good example of that society.
Mhm.
What's an example of a society that's ameliorated inequality between two groups like that, the way you're talking about?
I'm not claiming that there's a
Has that
society
ever
that's
happened?
existed. I'm saying that would be something to
Okay. So this is what you're asking
change the
me.
dynamics.
You're asking me to believe something that's happened a lot in the past will not happen in the future because something that's never happened in the past will happen now. That's what you're asking me to believe. Would you bet on that happening?
If there's a good
Something that's
reason to
happened in the
believe
past is
that
not
what
going to
you're
happen
trying to
again.
change is a driving causal force, what is standing in between actually producing some level of equity and equality between majority minority groups?
Well, that's an interesting question, and we will get to that, but that's not the question I just asked. You're asking me to essentially bet the future of my posterity, which you don't care about, but I do, on the fact that something that has historically happened won't happen in the future, but something that's never happened in the past will happen now. Even though, like, is it happening now? Are we ameliorating the differences between the minority groups that are entering this country? I don't see that.
No, I don't see it either. I think that's a
Okay, so
cause
this isn't
of
even
love strife.
happening. So you're not even doing what could possibly ameliorate this right now.
Well, no, the system that we're participating in is sort of designed not to do it. It's the way
No,
the system works.
oh, and it's the way every system worked all the way back in human history.
I mean, so if we want to talk about
I
other,
want to say that has any society ever done this in the past?
I don't know enough. I don't know enough history of groups going back to even more egalitarian periods of.
Isn't that kind of an important question? Because if it's never been done in human history, which to my knowledge it kind of hasn't, then why would you bank a lot on it happening in the future?
Because I think that it would solve the issues, whether or not it's been
It
done
would solve
before
it
doesn't
if
mean
it's
it's not
possible,
possible.
though. If it's possible. But if it's never happened in the past and it's not happening now, wouldn't you ask yourself whether it is possible?
Not entirely. I think for the most part, we've been
Why
acting
would
under a
you
very
ask
similar framework.
I'm sorry, but this is an incredibly incurious position for a scientist to take. You're seeing a phenomenon that's never happened, and you're not wondering if it's not impossible. That's the next logical question any scientist would ask themselves.
That's not my thought process behind it. My thinking is that this appears to be a major cause of the issue, so it's something that should be attempted to be addressed. And I think the extent to which it could solve the problem,
That wasn't even the answer to the question. I said whether it's possible to address it.
yeah, I think it
Yeah.
is. I'm
Why do you
optimistic
believe that?
because I don't
Why do you
view
believe that it's possible?
because I don't view the historical occurrences as evidence that it's not possible. I just view them
So
as
you don't
evidence that
you
it hasn't
believe
happened.
it's possible to do this because the past isn't in an indication about how the future behaves.
Yeah, exactly.
That's insane. That's literally you're literally violating. If we didn't think the past was an indication of how the future operated, we couldn't do science.
I
That
mean, of
you're
course we could.
violating Hume's
We could just
inductive hypothesis. Like it's like saying, well, the sun rose every single day, you know, from the past to the future, but it won't rise tomorrow because we can't induct on observations. How do you do science with this assumption?
I do science because I find it intellectually engaging, to be
I didn't
completely
say why
honest.
you do science. I said, how would you do science under that assumption that the
Oh,
past doesn't influence the future?
I do it with not as much interest in attaining or discovering truth.
So you're not interested in discovering truth?
No, not really.
Okay, I do science to discover truth. I'm beginning to see your motivations here. You don't care about posterity, you don't care about truth, and you're doing science because it's an intellectual game that amuses you. But most people do care about truth, and they do care about the well-being of their civilization, families, and cultures going forward into the future.
Sure.
And
I
so
guess
I really care that it's possible to make this multiracial thing work.
that's understandable.
And so this brings me to the question of race realism, and this is my interest in it. If the heritability on group features is really, really, really high, then it's going to be really, 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 really hard to ameliorate the inequalities between groups.
Not really, actually. And
well, we've already demonstrated that we have no historical examples of this happening.
I don't think heritability can. If we want to claim that that's the case, heritability isn't the way to show it.
What is the way to show it?
So the way to show it would be to take genetically homogeneous or genetically identical individuals. Now, this is me speaking from my plant background. To take genetically identical individuals and grow them across a range of environments and see the norm of reaction, as it's called, of how trait values differ by environmental changes. So,
and you know the two-word answer I'm going to give to this, because I have listened to the alt-hype stuff and I know the two-word answer he would immediately drop on you. Twin studies. We have them.
No, twin studies don't do that.
Well, that's as close as you possibly can get with humans. What's closer than twin studies for doing just the experiment you were describing?
There's not, and that's where
that's great. You can't make any statement about it. So it's just I don't know.
No, it's that the quality of data that we can possibly ascertain is not sufficient to answer the questions that we have.
Okay, great, but we have other data from other situations, right? Like, you just proposed a method of solving this problem. Your method fails because we can't do the experiment to the level of confidence you want, but we still have to answer the question.
Sure, and I think that there's a lot of reasoning why we should expect environmental moderation, the ability to change these traits.
Like what? But you just said that the best study we have to demonstrate this was the twin study, and it goes against your hypothesis.
I said the twin study was as good as we could do. I don't know if that's not really a comment.
So the best we can do shows that the hypothesis is false, but there's still reasons to believe that the hypothesis is true.
But no, twin studies still don't show that sort of result. So one, twin studies normally don't randomize environments. Twin studies.
Is there evidence that shows that the twin studies is as good as we can we do better than the twin studies?
Not within the ethical bounds of science.
Oh, okay, great. So we have some evidence that shows that it's false, but not enough. Or I mean, so how do you come out of this? How does your proposition win? Because there's evidence that show it loses.
No, the twin study does. Twin studies, so would you mind explaining?
It's not the best. It's just something. It's just something.
Could you explain how you think twin studies support that traits can't be changed?
Okay, because if you take, so basically we have a number of variables. I think about this statistically, which is a very good way to think about it, because what I love about statistics is that, and understanding randomness, is that you can go to any field and treat it as an uncertainty problem with observations. And because of that, it's a very fundamental science. We have a number of dimensions that could possibly influence traits. Twin studies control an enormous number of those variables by co-locating the genetics. and then trying to, as best as possible, randomize everything else. Now, that will essentially control for a lot of variables, more variables than I'm aware of anything else controlling. And in these twin studies, we see still an enormous effect that the genetic predictor has. Now, could that be due to a lurking variable? Of course, it always could be. But outside of actually growing people in vats, like in the Matrix, you're not going to get a more controlled, I'm not aware of a more controlled experiment than that. So we have one experiment that is as controlled as we can make it. It's not perfect, but it's as controlled as I can make it in my mind, showing that your hypothesis is false. But you're asserting that it's true. And the only thing I've heard so far is twin studies aren't perfect. Well, granted. But if you're going to want me to accept your hypothesis, you're going to have to tell me more than the experiments that disprove your hypothesis are less than perfect.
Yeah. So
what's your actual positive evidence?
Yeah. So very broad evidence is that through Turkheimer and Paige Harden and Elliott Tucker-Drobe, we see a changing of heritability depending on socioeconomic status. So that's like a first sign that there are different dynamics responsible for traits across different environments. We see this recapitulated also when you look at international meta-analyses and the degree to which education or intelligence are heritable in different countries with different developmental status or different education systems.
That's a less controlled experiment than the twin studies, though.
But it does add in one potentially lurking variable, which is the differences in environments.
Well, no, I mean it's a less controlled experiment, so I still think the twin studies are a better indication of heritability generally.
So heritability isn't a uniform measure, though.
I understand it's not a uniform measure, but these are just. The thing is, though, the thing is you're trying to hold your opponents to a higher evidentiary standard than you're holding your own beliefs to.
No, I don't think so at all. Because
I'm not so sure. I mean, you're talking about, you described an experiment. When I asked you the mechanism we would solve this problem, you described an experiment. And the best way we have of approximating that is the twin studies. The comparisons between countries add in more variables. They don't take more variables out.
But even within country comparisons, these meta-analyses have already indicated that it happens.
What happens?
That there's a changing degree of heritability depending on socioeconomic status, a very rough measure of socioeconomic status.
That has 1,000 other lurking variables that the twin studies don't have, right? They have variables concerning the individual economic
across different environmental strata.
We don't know that what you're reading isn't actually a genetic signal that's disguised under changing economic conditions.
How would you propose some sort of genetic etiology for something as dynamic and contingent as socioeconomic status? I
would take genetically identical individuals, split them up into different environments, and see how they behave. That's what I would do. And the closest thing to that is the twin studies.
That's still not what twin studies do, though. So
they approximate that, though. They don't do it exactly. They approximate it.
And the degree of error that they had by missing lurking gene environment correlation and lurking G by E and putting those into improper variance components.
But you have the same problem with your studies. Moreover, you have the problem that you're not controlling for genetics in your studies. So the key variable that we're trying to explore is going all over the place. It could be that the people who are upwardly mobile are genetically more capable for some reason. It's just been masked. And what we're seeing is essentially that effect getting reclassified as your desired predictor.
But those studies control for both parental and they control for income across generations, so it's not just.
They don't control for genes, though, which is that's the big confounder, though.
They're a twin study. They do control for genes.
No, the twin studies do. The country comparisons don't. The ones that you listed to support your hypothesis don't.
I also listed Turkheimer and Harden and Elliott Tucker-Drobe's meta-analysis, which are within the United States across socioeconomic strata of twins. And those studies show shifting dynamics of heritability depending on your socioeconomic level.
So it's a different twin studies that don't show the effects that the other twin studies showed, essentially?
These show a different degree, and that the degree is dependent on the socioeconomic status.
Okay, but why wouldn't that? So it still shows heritability. it just shows that the heritability is modeled by socioeconomic status. That indicates to me that heritability has a strong factor, and we're seeing an interference with socioeconomic status, which I would just grant because it's obviously true.
That's two sources of causation for these traits. And changing
okay,
either of
so
them will change trait values.
no, but the thing is, in order for you to satisfy my condition, you would need to show that you could modulate a socio. I mean, it's even stronger than that. What you're saying is like, okay, if a twin got rich, then maybe these traits are less heritable than we thought, like you won the lottery or something like that, right? But what will need to occur in order for my concerns to be addressed would be that a socioeconomic policy could be implemented such that the heritability we're seeing from groups could be totally erased in its effect.
Sure. So,
and there's just like no evidence of that. And it seems to, I mean, the problem is that like, you know, well, okay, go ahead. I want to kind of segue us, but go ahead.
Okay.
So I think we kind of, when you have conflicting studies, we just have to kind of like move on.
Yeah, but I was gonna go into a more full-fledged discussion into different things that I was going to talk about with regards to genetic causation of group differences.
But I don't care about what causes group differences. I just care that the group differences are heritable. Because I don't care what caused them. All I care about is that we can't fix them. Because if we can't fix hold on, if we can't, this links to my previous line of thought, right? If we can't fix the inequality, then all of those negative impacts that we both agreed would happen in the unequal society, in which I think I have ample evidence to show that the group differences actually exacerbate them from history, those all will become instant in our society if we can't fix this.
Okay, so I think that's a really important point, is that even if we take twin study heritability estimates at face value, and even if we conclude that the environmental component doesn't have a major contribution, that doesn't tell us how changeable or immutable something is. That is actually just not the information contained within heritability estimates.
Well, no, but here, if something is highly heritable, then it's very difficult to change.
No, not at all.
What does that mean? Heritability just means the previous generation has it, the next generation has it.
In the presence of selection. So if you would entertain a very simplified toy example, if you've heard it before, you can stop me. So imagine that you have a field of corn of uniform quality. Mm-hmm. All the variance there is solely genetic because the field is uniformly good. Mm-hmm. So heritability is 1. You have a second field, all genetically identical, with genetic variability, uniformly poor quality. All the variances due to genetics, the heritability is 1, but the difference between those two groups is purely environmental based off the quality of the fields. So heritability is the variance of the trait explained by the variance of genetics.
Fair enough. What you're saying is that we can control the environment. The problem is that we don't see the differences in group performance in this country controlling for environment. For instance, I come from Northern California, and I've spent some time living in Berkeley, and Berkeley has one of the highest racial achievement group gaps in the entire nation. And they're the most progressive community, and they're also one of the richest.
So
Berkeley, not Oakland, mind.
Yeah. Interestingly, the sociologist Dalton Conley, who does a lot of biological research, wrote a pretty thorough book about 15 years ago now, maybe more, about the impact that wealth has. And so he ran a lot of basically a series of multiple regressions trying to understand different components that explain differences between Black and white Americans. So for things like educational attainment, you could pretty much ameliorate the entire achievement gap solely with socioeconomic status and wealth. And wealth is sort of this important factor because wealth is transgenerational.
From getting economic degrees, but not from actual test scores. And the problem is the reason why I don't like the variable of economic attainment is, again, 2-word answer. We have a bias here. It's obvious, right? Preferences or affirmative action, if you prefer.
It was education. So it's getting a bachelor's, getting a getting a high school degree, dropping
Ibid.
out.
Ibid. I mean, it's I'm afraid, like, if the idea is, okay, well, we can have massive preferences throughout our society in order to rectify the differences between the groups involved, then I mean, but this is the thing: affirmative action was introduced as a temporary measure, not something that was going to be endemic in our society for all time. And if it's endemic in our society for all time, I think we have a serious problem.
No, I agree. In fact, a lot of the book traces missteps in affirmative action in not addressing what the core problem is, which the core problem that the book posits is this immense wealth gap. So even if you help a Black student get into university with affirmative action, there's still going to be major differences in how much they can achieve or how much assistance they can get from their parents, or how much wealth that they've themselves attained.
No, but it wouldn't impact the differences. I mean, I haven't really studied this as thoroughly as the alt high paths, but I've studied some, right? And the thing is that I know that if you control for wealth, we still see a massive achievement difference. I mean, Herdenstein and Murray documented this in their book, The Bell Curve, in 96? And this has been repeated again and again. It's not just a wealth gap.
I mean, so like I said, for educational attainment, like this book posits it down to wealth and socioeconomic status. So one thing to kind of point out that's important is that socioeconomic status is a blunt measure. You take occupation, income, and I can't remember the third factor, to be totally honest. But so
but this is
yeah.
The point is that you think that there's some way. Well, I mean, I need to kind of like take a step back here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what I'm interested in is there a way? We both agree that persistent group inequality is dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So far, and we also agree that to this date, nothing we've tried has really fixed this problem. I'm waiting if there isn't a good example of it fixing the problem.
So,
but before you answer, I'm
yes.
not talking. This is another thing too. I'm not talking about countries that farm off the best and brightest people from China and India, bring them over and high five themselves because they're so smart, bright, and wealthy. I'm not surprised if you take the elites of India and China and then put them into Silicon Valley, they still do well. They were doing well in India and China when they were farmed out of there. I'm talking about taking populations that are actually underperforming and then uplifting them through some explicit policy, as was promised in the 60s by the left. Have we seen any success in that?
So there has been evidence that to the extent that it is acting, the Flynn effect has had somewhat differential effects on Black and white scores.
The Flynn effect. Well, you're putting this on. I mean, you're not. I mean, the Flynn effect is uniform, though.
The Flynn effect was not uniform across American subsamples, as far as I can recall.
So the Flynn effect is going much faster in African American populations.
The end result of the Flynn effect was that the gap between white and Black scores and achievement had narrowed.
Okay, so you're expecting the passage of time to narrow the gap?
No, that is just to show that it can.
I'm not interested in that it can. It could. I'm interested in that it will.
Well, it has.
Like, I'm invested.
So I can outline a few examples of known causes, known environmental causes of IQ.
But I'm asking if you can do something. I'm not asking if like an imaginary scenario could be fixed in. But this is the fundamental thing. I mean, have you ever heard of like a person called Nassim Nicholas Taleb?
Mm-hmm.
Like, He talks about something called skin in the game. Like if you were to bet like money on this outcome, or like is it like a toy, right? Is this like, like if I because people are willing to like believe a lot of bullshit, right? Like on things that they don't have investments in, right? Like humans are really good at doing that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if they have skin in the game, they tend to not accept bullshit. And like a bullshit thing is going like, well, how's my portfolio doing? Well, it might have made money. Well, like, is it going to make money or isn't it? Right? Like I have money riding on this. More than that, I have potentially danger for my posterity riding on this outcome. And you're telling me that it might be fixed? I mean, it's been 50 years since the 60s. It's been half a century.
I think you're overestimating, though, the extent to which things have actually improved.
Really? Like what
Yeah.
like in terms of the gap?
Yeah. So
You think that from 1970 to where we are now is like a promising improvement?
I think actually in a very material sense, no, it hasn't.
Well, okay, I'm sorry, but this is what I'm looking at, and I'm forced to come back again to this, that the problem has not been fixed. And the problem has not been fixed, and I'm going to put this again, the problem has been largely in areas of this country that have been under total progressive control for 40 years. Yet all the progressives talk endlessly about how diversity is awesome. They talk endlessly about how they're going to fix the racial achievement gap. At the end of the day, nothing gets fixed, and they all send their children to private schools.
I'm like, if you're looking for someone to defend kind of like a liberal white elite, it's not really going to be the position I'm going to try.
I'm asking you why you're not going to become the next generation of white elite.
So because I think that,
like, are you going to have children? I mean, maybe you're not going to have children, right? But like, if you were, like, you're either going to fix the inner city schools in 7 years, or you're going to send your white kids into inner city schools. That's the only difference between you and the previous generation of progressive elites. Seven years.
I mean, if you want the real answer, the historical traction has happened to the extent that 7 years isn't going to fix it. It's going to take a very huge.
Okay, so you literally will be the last generation. You are going to repeat the pattern if you were to have children right now.
Is the question, would I like choose a charter school to send my kid to?
You're trying to okay, right now, or in the previous generation of progressives talked endlessly about racial equality, about diversity, and without exception, they all sent their children to magnet schools, either charter schools, private schools, or they did little games with like rental property to get their kids into schools that were highly populated by whites, Jews, and Asians.
And no, I'm not going to do
this and this is just undeniable, right?
Yeah.
It's undeniable that progressives have played this game. Now I'm saying like, and when I brought this up, you're like, I'm sorry, but it seemed to me like you were trying to poo-poo them, like, oh, those guys, they're racist, but the thing is if you had skin in the game the way they did, would you send your kids to horrible failing inner city schools that put them at risk, or could you fix the schools in 7 or 8 years by the time you had kids that were entering the system? Could you fix the schools in 7 to 8 years?
No, the schools can't be fixed in 7 or 8 years.
So if you were to have kids right now, you'd be exactly like they were, talking endlessly about how great diversity was, and then putting your kids into charter schools.
No, I would not be putting my kids into charter schools.
What would you do with them then?
I would take them to whatever schools in the area.
Even if it was a highly dangerous, low-achieving urban school? Come on.
If that's where I was. I went to a low-achieving rural school.
Low-achieving rural schools. I mean, this is a different scenario. There's a certain amount of danger that's attached to these schools. And I'm sorry, I'm afraid I don't believe this.
I mean, I am seriously opposed to charter schools and magnet schools and gaming the system like that. Part of the reason why
you're opposed to it. No, I'm not. Let me clarify. I'm not skeptical that you're like opposed to it in the abstract. Every progressive is opposed to it in the abstract. I haven't met a single progressive in my entire life. Okay, I come from a progressive area. I know tons of people in Berkeley. I know tons of people in San Francisco. I know tons of people in New York. Do you know what they all have in common? They're all totally against charter schools, totally against magnet schools, and totally against white flight. And none of them sent their children into majority black schools that were incredibly low achieving. So how seriously should I take your assertion that you're against those in the abstract, but you wouldn't do it in the practical time?
I mean, you could phone me in 10 or 15 years if you're really bent on it, but
Yeah, and I'm saying what you're asking me to believe right now is that all past experience is no indication of how the future will behave. And if I believe that, I don't even know how I do science. All of science is predicated on the fact that similar things in the past occur similarly in the future. Otherwise, we would have no reason to believe that the sun would rise tomorrow. Okay, so let's segue off this. So perhaps I can just segue this up. I think we've kind of exhausted the whole racial group thing. Do you see the concerns that people on the far right have with this issue?
I understand the concerns. I think their solution is just completely wrong. I think it's an unwillingness to address the root issue, even if the root issue is a very hard thing to address.
No, well, we believe that the root issue is impossible to address.
I don't think it's impossible to address. I think
Well, I
it'll
know
be
you don't
an
think it's
enormous
impossible to address,
undertaking.
but we do.
I mean, if you look at the amount of effort and resources that the United States has spent on things, we have definitely moved bigger mountains.
Well, I mean, we've certainly spent a lot of money on this, and if progressives want to fix this problem, I don't see why for the next 50 years, we try this experiment. I don't see why they don't actually put their money where their mouth is and get skin in the game, literally.
I think that's a serious issue. Part of the reason why white flight occurs is the psychological effect of leaving when a community gets past a certain tipping point. If people didn't behave that way, the problem wouldn't occur. If people would stay and invest their money in local schools that are failing, they would improve to some extent based off of a stronger tax base. Like the role of segregation in issues that occur is immense, and that is driven by even progressively minded people.
But the thing is that the contention, you understand how conservatives, I don't see how you could blame somebody for not believing in something that's never happened in the past and that is not happening right now.
It's because I don't think there's been the closest that we came to a genuine effort that I still think came up short was the attempt to create the Great Society.
Well, I mean, during that time, you have all of the problems we're seeing right now emerging. You have during the Great Society, the illegitimacy rate in the black community skyrocketed, the crime community in the black community skyrocketed, and the drug problem in the black community skyrocketed.
The drug problem was engineered, though. That was a concerted.
I'm not so sure about that. I think this is a conspiracy theory on the left.
That was in an on the books interview with one of the heads of Nixon's policy, though.
He's like, we're going to get blacks addicted to crack cocaine so we can destroy the black community. Blah.
He did like that. The quote is literally about criminalizing marijuana to get anti-war people and black people to crack down on
marijuana had nothing to do with the explosion of drug abuse in the black community. The explosion of abuse in the black community was largely cocaine and derivative things like crack, not marijuana.
Marijuana's had a huge impact, and the difference.
It's not the thing I was talking about.
Cocaine are another example of like concerted efforts.
Down a black hole. Okay, but was crime did the federal government also manufacture the crime explosion in the 60s during the Great Society? Does that also?
No, but those also have explanations that don't come down to like immutable features. So things like welfare usage, those are and premarital childbirth, those are wildly dependent on wealth and socioeconomic status. There's an entire chapter dedicated to that.
Did the wealth of the African American community decrease in the 60s?
It probably never increased. It's been so if you
Okay,
want
but
if you want
if it stayed the same, then it can't be driven by wealth.
but
Because
there are other
if the
social
wealth stayed the
factors.
same, if the wealth stayed the same, regardless of whether the wealth stayed the same or decreased or increased even a little, the childless rate skyrocketed. So it can't be a driver.
It very well could be if you also consider
Fatherlessness, I should say, not the
the
childlessness.
changes of social mobility that were happening that were not reflected in actual material change. Like you passed the Civil Rights Act, you passed the
Sorry.
Voting Rights Act. Those things didn't actually change any economic situations for Black Americans.
Therefore, they can't be the driver behind a statistic that exploded during that time. If those factors didn't change, the crime and father and out of wedlock births did change radically. Therefore, the things that didn't change couldn't statistically, reasonably, be attributed to to causing the thing that did radically change. I know this all relies on inductive reasoning, and we seem to have a problem with inductive reasoning. But this is typically how we establish causation. If something changes radically, you can't attribute it to something that didn't change at the same time.
But there are other factors that were changing at the same time. The fact that social mobility was changing and economic mobility wasn't changing could be a flashpoint that would generate social upheaval. I mean, I'm telling you that
I don't know. I
in
mean,
the
this is like we're just speaking in vagaries now. We're saying that something like something vague called social upheaval must have caused this, regardless of what happened. The upheaval or whatever. I just think upheaval is things changing, and things certainly did change during the Great Society in the '60s. But whatever changed there, something in that time period drove an enormous spike of out of wedlock births, drug use, and violent crime in these communities.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to
Unprecedented.
describe is that for a period in the 80s to 90s, the explanation or the those changes were accounted for by largely differences in parental wealth and socioeconomic status. Both those things are heavily moderated by those facts. So
Well,
unless
but that's again, we're down a rabbit hole because we agreed that those two things didn't change over the time frame or change in the opposite direction that you're implying with that statement.
then you need to propose a reason why these things explain these factors in the 80s and in the 90s, but why they somehow wouldn't explain them in the 60s and
I
70s.
have an answer. It's a really depressing one.
Okay.
What to my best recollection, what happened is there were a bunch of social systems that the African American community had to enforce behavior inside of itself. However, during the Great Society, through a combination of things like the leaders of the African American community essentially getting jobs in white society and the introduction of welfare, which created a huge perverse incentive. And you can see Charles Murray's book Losing Ground, and there's numerous other books. Thomas Sowell describes this as well if you want a different source. Due to the incredible perverse incentive of welfare and the introduction of a counterculture that was fundamentally revolutionary, and need I mention the sexual revolution, all of the controls the African Americans had against these effects essentially were dismantled. We dismantled the African American community's immune system to bad ideas involving lots of lifetime sexual partners, drug use, and general rebellion against the system. And because of that, we have all these pathologies. Then in the 80s, we decided that because we couldn't fix the problem, we just throw all the people in jail, which we've pretty much been doing to this point. And so we essentially band-aided the problem of a destroyed African American community that was created in part by the Great Society by just throwing everyone in jail, which to my mind is a pretty shitty solution. I don't know if I have a better one. Presumably the better one is just to actually have a lot of violent crime, which is not perhaps not better because that just means there's a lot more dead people in these communities. But this was the band-aid solution that came from a destruction of a societal norm that occurred in the 60s. That is my depressing story for why this happened. And it fits the facts a lot better than, well, something mysterious happened with social upheaval. Great Society was awesome. The sexual revolution was awesome. The 60s were awesome, but somehow all these pathologies came roaring out of it in this community. a bunch of awesome things happened and the societies we were talking about fell apart, is what I'm expected to believe. And I'm afraid that I have a very difficult time believing that.
I mean, when you couple it with the fact that the growth of white and black wealth were completely disparate at the time, I still don't see why there's any reason to discount the very strong relationship that we see through several decades after.
But
long standing.
The thing is with a large multivariate analysis, and this is, I'm going to try to segue to, I'm back to my question, because I guess I didn't want to get into the weeds, but we did, and that's how these things work, right? There's always going to be a possibility that some mystery variable is operating behind the scenes that I don't see and that you don't see, and that's always a possibility, right? There's always a possibility that secretly gnomes are causing all of these problems. And once we get rid of the gnome problem, the invisible gnome problem, this problem will be fixed. And I want to respect people who believe in these invisible lurking variables because they keep us humble. They keep us always ability to question our premises. And you're right to try to make me question my premises, right? You're right to say, well, distributist, you're looking at all these macrocosmic effects, but correlation doesn't equal causation, and you're absolutely right. And there's 1,000 other variables, and you're absolutely right about that too, right? And you could be wrong, and you're absolutely right about that too, right? But the problem is that I think that while it's good that you're here to remind me and to keep me humble, I don't think you can blame me for acting on macrocosmic trends that are highly observable and to actually taking safeguards and to coming up with safeguards that will protect my society from these things in the event that the very, very obvious trends will continue going forward.
Sure, but so here's where I'm gonna to stake my claim and basically just kind of lay out the entire core of my position. So there are two figures that I think dominate my framework, which is in 1865, Black Americans had 0.5% of wealth, and in 1990 they had 1% of overall wealth in the U.S. And that financial assets for a median Black family is $2,000, and for a white family it's $28,000. And I can't imagine that those factors don't play a significant role in the differences that we see when wealth relates to low birth weight. And low birth weight exerts a very strong environmental force on intelligence. When it leads to elevated stress levels, and maternal cortisol levels during pregnancy exert a strong effect on intelligence levels and IQ scores.
So you're saying it's not absolute wealth, you're saying it's relative wealth.
So it is both.
I don't physically see how that could be, but okay, fine. Because I'm trying to segue it, I'll grant that your explanation is relative wealth, not absolute wealth. But there's a problem with that, but not a scientific one. Well, there's a scientific problem in the fact that I can't even see logically how relative wealth would make a difference. But that's neither here nor there. Please continue. I apologize for interrupting.
No, the point is that there's a cascading effect of wealth disparity and poverty. When 41% of Black children are in poverty and roughly 10% of white children are, that's going to exert significant differences in outcomes for the population.
Well, yeah, there's going to be differential impacts, but we were talking about an absolute impact. But okay, that's fine. But so you're gonna. It feels like you're not giving your opponents their due. I'm pointing to a very realizable trend that does not have a lot of counter evidence against it, and you're telling me that I have to ignore that essentially. Now, it's fine if you want to believe in the very, very obscure explanation that has very little evidence to that, but I'd like you to bet with your money and not like society's money, because I think that to me, that creates a very, very difficult situation, right? I mean, this is the whole thing with relative wealth too. I mean, the reason why relative wealth, I mean, it's sort of like, the solution, the charlatans, like the problem with this, right? And sorry, can I call you Kevin? I think I did.
Go for it.
the problem with all this, Kevin, right? And like I gave all the caveats last time, is that you can always smell a scam because the solution is always to like give me your money, right? Like it always ends there, right? Like when do you ever like you ever get like hit with one of those phishing scams, like wire me like your routing number, right? Like it's always kind of funny, right? Because and every now and again you come across like a really good one, right? You always come across a really good one that like I mean, you're smart enough not to follow for it, but like you're almost like, if I were a few IQ points different, like I might fall for this one, but it's obviously a scam, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like every now and again, maybe you're younger than me and you haven't encountered a lot of these scammers, but like whenever you're suspecting, you're like, you know what? I bet in the next paragraph, like they're going to segue to the part where I give them my money, and then like sure enough, in the next paragraph they do, right? And that's how you kind of know the scammers, right? You know the scammers because they always inevitably get to the point where like you're supposed to hand over your cash. And the problem is that what's sort of indelible about all of these things is it's a justification to essentially take money from the general coffers. Like no progressives are like, we're going to create a community where all the races have equal achievement. And we're going to use our own money to create this system. And it's going to be the racial utopia. And after we build this, you guys can all copy our model. If you were saying that, I would be like totally on board with that. But you're not saying that. You're saying that we haven't fixed these problems in 50 years of trying in communities where we've had 99% control over the political system. We haven't fixed the problems with segregated schools and differential racial achievement rates. And furthermore, when we haven't fixed them, we've sent our children to segregated schools. But don't worry, America. If you hand over more money at the federal level and totally reconfigure the educational system in order to essentially create conspiracy theories against your own descendants, create conspiracies where the reason why people aren't achieving well in inner city schools is because of some nefarious quality of whiteness, that's the solution that's going to make us actually achieve something. Like give us essentially the right to demean your posterity and rights to essentially use your posterity's money in order to fix this problem, and then we'll fix the problem, even though we have every opportunity to use our own money to fix the problem and we just don't.
So I can't help but agree with the point that I wouldn't trust democratic establishment to properly enact change. The most progressive policy enacted for the New Deal was actually like terribly harmful for progress for racial equality.
Okay, can I give you an example here? Okay,
sure.
Let's do a skin in the game experiment, right? So you said you'd send your child to an inner city underperforming school, right? Even though that wasn't fixed. You said that a few seconds ago, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't go through like hoops to do a different school.
Well, okay, you said yeah. Let's say yes or no. It's yes, right? You said you do that. Okay, even though that largely impacted his ability to get into college and then a grad program. It would, right? It would. We know from the statistics it would, right? Okay, so you're willing to sacrifice your hypothetical child's education. Would you give up your slot in the PhD program you're in for an African American right now? Go down to the registrar and say, I'm disenrolling from my university, give it to the next person who applied for me who's not white. Well, I know you haven't done that.
Yeah.
So your hypothetical child's educational opportunity worth a lot less to you than your own. That's skin in the game. That's skin in the game. Chalk is cheap. You're not actually sacrificing your resources that you could be sacrificing to fix this problem.
But so I'll push back. You've called out some good hypocrisy. So the idea of lifeboat ethics, I believe, is the idea that like the personal investment that I can make can only make so many changes. If it's a social and a systemic problem, the changes need to be society and system wide.
That's convenient, isn't it? I mean,
it's very challenging, actually.
Well, no, it's convenient for you because you're off the hook on personal sacrifice.
Well, I don't necessarily want to be. If there's a way to actually for me
Of
to
course you
sacrifice to
don't
enact
want to
change,
be
I
because you
would.
don't actually think it'll make a difference.
I mean, so for it's the same reason why I don't give $100 to a homeless person, but I do try to enact policy changes that would eradicate homelessness.
Well, see, I'm the opposite. I think it's better to actually volunteer and give your own money to the homeless shelters, which is why well, I mean, I'm a little busy with my PhD now, but like a year or two ago, I was really involved with that. Uh, but I'm sorry, but Kevin, wouldn't all of those progressives, Democrats in big cities that you were saying, I want to disassociate from myself from these people, wouldn't they give the exact same answer? Oh, it's a systematic problem. I can't sacrifice any of my wealth. Systematic problem. So we just need to address it as a society.
But the difference
And
is
then
that
you're
I'm
back.
I'm a
Then you're back to asking for other people's money.
but the difference is that I'm a grad student making like $25,000 a year, and a lot like how many millions of dollars do like Democratic elites have, or do the most wealthy possess? Like an immense amount of money that could never be consumed
Okay,
in a
but
single lifetime.
no, it's your you have your money. I mean, a PhD, a slot in a PhD program is money in the future. Like that's as close as you have to money is your role at this school,
But
which you manifestly won't give up, right? I
it's
mean, like,
not usable right now.
well, it sure it is. The slot is usable by some other person.
But then again, we're into the same thing of like the reason why affirmative action hasn't worked is that it's addressing the wrong problem. Placement isn't the main problem. It's not the core problem.
No, I'm not. In this experiment, I wasn't making a case about affirmative action. I was making a case about how the policy recommendations you're making and the aspersions you're casting on other leftists really ring hollow in my assertion. Like, I mean, if you want to take money away from, like, George Soros or whatever to fix this problem, well, convince him to not give money to activist organizations that go after reactionaries, like the SPL, like whatever he donates to. I don't know if he donates to the SLP, Southern Poverty Law Center, but I think he does, or Planned Parenthood. Ask them to give their money to fix this problem. But in the meantime, like, why don't you cut people who don't think this is going to work some slack? I don't think this is going to work. I shouldn't have to use my money for a project that is, I think, manifestly not going to work.
I mean, I don't want anyone to do that. What I want to do is try to create or to engage in a plan that would work. That
See,
if I give half my income, it will actually yield legitimate benefits to people.
and what is that? I mean, wouldn't every progressive say this? Every progressive has told me something like that.
I mean, I guess, but there are like empirical, like the NHS is a good example.
So, I mean, every progressive says this, and how hasn't it happened in highly progressive areas?
So I mean, the reason I'll give you because I'm a I lean socialist is because we're not acting in the right economic system to make it happen. Capitalism is never going to allow these things to happen.
Oh, great. So, how much power do I have to give you before? Like, do I have to give you, like, basically, we have to destroy capitalism from the globe before this problem is fixed?
Maybe that's kind of why I have not chosen to camp on the left yet. I'm still figuring out what I think the best solution would be.
I'm sorry, but like, how would anyone who doesn't agree with this, like, buy this? Right? I don't have to give you, like, because the alt, like, let's look what the alt right's asking for. The alt right is asking for a tiny part of the area where it can try its ideas out. In order to try your idea, I literally have to give you all the power in the entire world.
I don't. The point actually wouldn't be to give me the power; it'd be to redistribute the power
To give an
all people.
anti-capitalist system that would be progressive, ultimate power.
The point though is that public ownership benefits the entire public, not just.
Well, no, but the thing is that I don't believe that. you're saying, and moreover, like if public ownership happens and conservatives start voting a certain way, you'll claim that they ruined the public ownership by trying to use it in ways you didn't like.
I mean, by ways I didn't like, is there going to be ways that are harmful and destructive to people? Like, because that would be a problem. If it's,
I think we're missing the point here. I mean, you're saying the reason why progressive communities haven't been able to implement their utopia is because of global capitalism.
even just domestic, like, I don't think there's a single Democrat that actually wants to solve the problem.
So all the other progressives are racist, but you're not. And this is another joke. Do you ever heard this joke that you probably run mostly progressive circles, but there's this joke that reactionaries tell. Like, what's progressive stand up? Well, progressive stand up is 100 white progressives go into a comedy club. One white progressive gets up in front of them and goes, every white person in the world is racist except me. And then all the other progressives laugh and say to each other, every other white person in the world is racist except me. It's funny because it's true.
So
every progressive I talk to always insinuates that the other progressives are racist and don't really want racial equality, but they do.
So I'm going to just separate the race and class issue, because I don't think that a lot of the animosity actually comes from explicit racism. It's really just not wanting to cede power. I don't think that other general voters are necessarily worse than me. I think that the people who actually possess political power in the US are the problem. The representatives, the people who actually could enact change, don't want to because they are in a position that benefits them perfectly fine how they are now.
I mean, what are they specifically not doing, if I may ask? Like, like you're a congressman, like you're Bernie Sanders or whatever. Like, what's Bernie Sanders not doing?
So, like, Bernie Sanders is doing fine for the most part. He's one person. He doesn't hold a plurality or minority.
What is like the standard Democrat like not doing? Like that he secretly knows this is going to fix the problem, right?
So think about the solution proposed for the healthcare crisis, Obamacare versus a single payer option. The amount of benefits and money that insurance companies got from that, and the amount of money that politicians got from insurance companies. I understand
they had to work with insurance companies because people didn't want to lose their insurance.
They didn't have to work with insurance companies because a single payer system would have made the middleman of insurance obsolete.
You can't. There's no way that without massively increasing the taxes in this country that we could have paid for a single payer that would have covered everyone in the plans they currently have right now.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with tax increases. Okay. That would be like a tangible.
Well, of course you don't, because you don't pay them. I'm fully aware that you don't care about money that isn't yours being spent. But that's not my contention. My contention is that the difficulty is that I point to an acute problem, and you say that the only way you can fix the acute problem is to continuously give more power to progressives on other issues that have nothing to do with that acute problem. So the reason why we can't have equality of races is because we didn't give enough power to the far left wing of the Democratic Party to enact single payer against the explicit wishes of the American people.
Single payer has fairly high popularity.
It has fairly high popularity when you pitch it without the tax payments. When you pitch it with the tax payments, it has very low popularity.
Yeah, but how do you know that? How do you pitch it
if
you also included the benefits gained from not paying insurance?
Because you ask people questions like, would you pay this percentage of your taxes to have, this with this kind of coverage? And they usually say no. So the problem that you have in this country, regardless of that wasn't my main point, but we can argue healthcare. The point is, I brought up racial equality, and the reason you said they couldn't solve it was because Democratic senators didn't get a sweeter deal on healthcare. But see, this is always this problem. It's like, why haven't you delivered on this thing that you promised? It's like, well, it's because you haven't given me more money and power. And like the problem is that's the scammer line, right? The scammer, whenever I would go, if I never actually fell for fishers, right? But if you went back for a fisher and go like, well, why haven't you delivered me the gold, the Nigerian gold you promised me? And like, well, sir, if you just give me another bank account so I could make a withdrawal, I'll be sure to have that gold to you right away. No, we're talking about a specific inequality with a school system, and you're asking me to give you what you want in a completely unrelated area. I mean, what it essentially amounts to is me just ceding your preferences over to you one by one, not because you've delivered on something in the past, but because you haven't delivered on a promise you made in the past.
The problem is that they're not unrelated. So general health relates to ability to learn.
They're related incredibly tangentially.
I mean, for things like low birth weight, it's an extremely strong relationship, and welfare is something that's been proven to attenuate low birth rate and infant mortality.
Okay, so I'm gonna make this another thing. You would never agree to this logic if it was posed by the right wing.
What would the converse of this logic
The
be?
equivalent logic would be like the Ayn Rand thing, which is like, let's deregulate this industry. And then you deregulate the industry and the industry fails. And you go back to the Ayn Rand objectivist and go, well, we deregulated this industry and it failed. And they're like, well, that's just because this other industry you haven't deregulated hasn't been deregulated yet, upstream from them in the supply chain. And of course, you have to deregulate that industry, and then you deregulate that industry and it fails. And you go back to them and go, well, it didn't work then. They're like, well, there's this third industry that you had to deregulate. I mean, they literally, people have played this game. I bet you didn't buy it then, right?
No, I don't
No, you
know
didn't,
how much I
right?
would believe, how much I buy into this analogy.
The analogy is that when you have a policy that fails, you point to some like kind of related, because everything in the world's related, right? Health and education is related. Energy sector and airlines are related, right? They both use fossil fuels, right? And when one policy position doesn't work, as opposed to actually trying to figure out what went wrong, you just go to the other one and go, well, because there's this distant relationship, give us what we want in this other area, and then of course everything else will work. And I mean, it's a recipe for me ceding more and more power and money to you, but it's not a winning heuristic generally in life.
I mean, I really don't know what else to tell you, but there's a slew of medically related issues like even like cortisol levels,
Yeah, no, I
low
know
birth
everything. I
weight,
know everything is
childhood
related.
trauma,
I know everything is related to everything else, but
and all those things are related to wealth.
that's
And
not the driver behind what's wrong with education. I can tell you that cortisol levels are not behind what's wrong with our education system. And we can do this. I mean, but it's to my I'm pretty convinced that I don't know. To my mind, this sounds like an excuse.
I mean, sure, you can believe that, but I
It seems pretty obvious. You're asking me. You failed to do something very specific in a school system, and you're asking me to give you more power on healthcare.
so is are you trying to figure out how to what the causes of the
No, I'd
black
ask
white
you to
achievement gap
deliver on a promise.
to
I'm saying
improve schools?
if progressives essentially say they can come up with a society that's racially integrated, that's group integrated, and it works. I want them to deliver on that without saying, okay, we coming back and saying, no, 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 you need to give us even more of your money. I don't believe they have a solution to this. If you do, I think you should bet on it, right? I mean, you're not currently betting the wealth you do have, but if you believe in the future that it will work, I would advise you to bet your own money on this and your own privilege.
I mean, I I don't know what else you're looking for. I think that understanding that decades and almost centuries of inaction can be resolved in like 7 years is pretty unrealistic.
I'm asking it to be resolved in 50 years. The only reason why you can
50?
say the reason why you can say 7 years is you can say all those other previous progressives weren't honest in their desire to fix this problem. That's how you get 7 years. There's been 50 years since the progressives started this project, and it hasn't worked in that time.
I mean, it hasn't been a full-fledged, genuine solution, and that's reflected in the fact that things really haven't
I know you
materially
haven't had a
changed.
solution. I know you don't have a solution. But I mean, who pays for the fact that you don't have a solution? I see. This is the thing too. I don't even care about paying taxes. Like, I do kind of care because I'm about to start a family, but it's not like, well, it's not the thing I'm really worried about. What I'm really worried about is that we're going to have this inequality problem when the groups that I belong to are like 20% of the population. And that the solution the left has to their manifest failure to solve this problem is to create complex conspiracy theories about how it's all white people's fault. In that scenario, my children and grandchildren are going to be paying for this, not through taxes, likely through blood. And that's what I'm really worried about. And quite frankly, the progressives can spend their own money, their own virtue, and their own privilege to fix this problem, and not the blood of the next generation. And I think if you're asking, and I'm not someone who's obsessed with race, if you're wondering why this alt-right thing is arising, even to somebody, this is an opinion that probably gets expressed most pertinently on the alt-right, but it's the opinion held by almost every other conservative, whether they admit it or not. They do not want to be sacrificing their grandchildren's safety because progressives can't come up with a solution to the race problem now, and haven't come up with a solution to this race problem in the last 50 years. We're not doubling down on this for the next generation until they can fix the problem as it exists currently. And I'm not paying more money right now on the chance that doubling down will fix it, especially since progressives themselves don't sacrifice their own money to fix it. And by your own admission, you don't sacrifice yours. There should be no mystery in your mind why people like me and other members of the radical right wing exist. And there will be more of us if these questions don't get much better answers than they're getting right now.
I mean, the ultimate problem, though, is that these solutions won't be solved without a complete concerted effort by everybody.
Yeah, I know they won't be solved. You're right. You're never going to get a concerted effort by everyone. This is reality we're talking about. You're never going to have 100% power on the entire globe. You have the power you have. With the power you have currently, you can't fix the problem. And that's a significant amount of power, I may add. The progressives have most of the voices in the city I live in. They had the voice in the city that I grew up in. They have the big voices in the cities that were around the area I grew up in. And they were unable to fix this problem in any one of those communities. You will never have 100% of the power, but considering how much power white progressives do have, I don't really want to give you any more. And in the meantime, the person that suffers when this doesn't work is not going, I will work tirelessly to make sure that the person who suffers when this doesn't work is not my grandchildren. The person who should suffer when this problem does not work is you and the rest of the people who propose the solution. If there's justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very conspiratorial, like doom and gloom forecasting.
Okay, yeah, it's pessimistic, not conspiratorial. I didn't tell a story about a conspiracy. I'm saying that the people who propose the policies should suffer when they don't work, not somebody else. And that's what essentially has happened in progressive communities. We had a great society. We had an explosion of crime, violence, and the only way we could be able to fix the crime problem is essentially by throwing an entire generation of African-American men in prison. All of those policies essentially came from progressives. And yeah, and it was the African-American community that suffered.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And, well, I mean, hey, this is why I value skin in the game. And it's why any solution I have would involve some measure of that. I want to see if progressives have a recipe for creating a cohesive interracial society. And I really want to see that, by the way. I love multiracialism. My parish is multiracial. I really dislike the alt-right's obsession with genotypical expression. I'm a person who's more focused on spirituality and culture, frankly. But like I said, I might not care about race, but hugely unequal racial society is a direct threat to my descendants in a very, very real way. So while I might not care about race, race cares about me and my descendants. And I can respect that enough to not want to actually double down on a policy and essentially create a situation that could be insanely dangerous for my descendants. I'm hoping that the left can respect that.
Yeah, I mean, I understand it, but this is also a policy that in some sense needs doubling down. It needs full commitment, because half commitment.
You're not fully committed.
I'm committed as much as I can be.
No, you're not. We already established one way that you're not.
I mean, if you think that anything would actually be resolved or improved by giving up a single spot in a PhD program.
No, it would show that you're fully committed, though.
I mean, committed to what?
Committed to the principles that you behave. I mean, as opposed to doubling down on the principles and having the African American community suffer again, or as opposed to doubling down on the principles and having the descendants, of my descendants or anyone else's descendants who gets blamed for this by some kind of racial conspiracy theory, like the progressives are daily spinning in the college I work at, as opposed to those groups suffering. Why not the people who propose it suffering? You want to double down, but you don't want to double down with your money. You want to double down with my descendants.
Well, I mean, I would, like I said, I would completely double down if it would work.
Yeah, but we don't know if it will work. There's a risk that it won't work. And who's going to suffer if it doesn't work? You're not going to suffer. Even I'm not going to really suffer. I might pay higher taxes. I might be in danger of losing a job because of my regressive opinions. But even I am not going to really suffer. Who's going to really suffer is the next generation. That's who's going to really suffer if this doesn't work. And they're my priority because I care about posterity. Anyway, I'm hoping that the left can learn to respect this opinion, because I can guarantee there are going to be more people who have it.
I agree. It's going to definitely be a growing sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be, I mean, you might have skin in the game that you don't realize.
Yeah, I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth considering. I mean, this is the thing, right? Anyway, I don't have anything else to say, so I think we'll just end it here. We didn't cover genetics, but again, I think we got to the heart of the disagreement. So thank you very much for appearing. Maybe I'll publish it. If you really don't want me to publish it, I won't. But feel free to share the link. This will be an unlisted conversation in the meantime. I know I'm hard. I like grilling people, especially since this isn't public. If this isn't public, I don't have to worry about looking like an asshole. But again, thanks for coming on and discussing. I think we kind of exhausted it. So have a great time and good luck with your PhD.
Thank you. You too.
Hopefully I'm about to finish. So
thanks a lot.
Well, not the child, just the marriage, but that's hopefully coming, God willing. Anyway, have a great night. See ya.